This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Claire McDonnell, and in the early hours of Thursday, the 20th of December, these are our main stories. Islamic State has been defeated in Syria, and the US is pulling its troops out, so says President Trump. Ahead of the first democratic elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo, an opposition rally in the capital takes place, despite attempts by authorities to ban it. Facebook is in hot water again over allegations it's sharing users' private information without their knowledge. Also in this podcast, the Tanzanian hip-hop artist banned from performing in his own country. And
we just feel that there's been a failure of leadership. I mean, ultimately it's clickbait, right? Let's not pretend it's anything more than it is, but it's very funny.
Why a newly discovered amphibian that buries its head in the sand has been named after Donald Trump. So, is it mission accomplished? President Trump says the Islamic State group has been defeated in Syria, and therefore American troops should withdraw from the country. But it's a controversial move, and not everyone in Washington is happy. One senator called it a big win for Moscow, Tehran, and what remains of IS. And here's the view of Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee.
I don't think it's the right time for us to be pulling out completely. However, it seemed as though the president's remarks were rather flippant. I mean, he did say that ISIS has been completely defeated. I'm not sure that the Pentagon feels that way. So, the president is known to make very spontaneous statements and tweets, and I have a feeling that this is one of them. So I wouldn't be surprised in the next couple of days if you don't hear him backtrack from that.
I asked our defence and diplomatic correspondent, Jonathan Marcus, if Islamic State in Syria really was defeated.
In military terms, in terms of an organisation that holds a large swathe of territory, Islamic State is pretty well defeated. The difficulty, of course, is that many of the problems, instability, chaos, which led to the rise of the movement continue in one form or another. And there are fears, of course, that a US pullout could simply accentuate that sense of chaos in the roughly 1/3 of Syria that remains outside the control of President Assad and his allies. This is a remarkable turnaround by the Americans. Up until now, the consistent US official position from the Pentagon, from the State Department, not least from Brett McGurk, who's the US Special Envoy, the President's Special Envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, so-called IS, he was saying only 2 weeks ago that nobody now is ready to declare mission accomplished. The talk from the Americans has long been about staying on the ground in Syria to secure what they call the enduring defeat of ISIS. Well, this completely changes that. Mr. Trump seems to have pulled this policy out of his back pocket, out of the blue.
How can this be then? How can he be saying one thing and all the experts in the field on his own side be saying something completely different just in the last couple of weeks?
Well, I think the problem is that it shows some of the contradictions and uncertainties. Some people might even say the chaos surrounding American policy, not just in Syria, but in the wider Middle East as well. If you listen to some of the more strident, more conservative voices in the Trump administration, they have argued that staying in Syria isn't just to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. They've said that it helps to contain rising Russian influence, that it helps to contain Iran's growing influence in the region, and if there is one sort of common denominator, one thread running through the Trump administration's policy towards the region, it would seem to be that of containing Iran. We know that America's Kurdish allies are under threat from the Turkish government, who wants to have a greater military push into northern Syria because it regards the Kurds as a serious threat to Turkish territory. We know that President Assad's regime would like to destroy these Kurdish fighters if they possibly could. So if the Americans pull out, is there going to be a vacuum? Are the Kurdish allies of the Americans going to be left in even greater jeopardy? Many, many questions still need to be answered. And so far, all we've had is these rather bland tweets from Mr. Trump himself.
Jonathan Marcus. Let's go to the Democratic Republic of Congo now, where there's been a show of defiance ahead of elections this weekend. Well, that is the sound of supporters of the opposition leader Martin Fayulu running away from tear gas being fired at them in Kinshasa. Mr. Fayulu was prevented by police from attending a rally of his own supporters who had already gathered ahead of a ban on campaigning. The city's governor had imposed the ban, saying he feared violence would erupt. I asked our reporter in Kinshasa, Louise Douast, for the latest on what's happened.
So local authorities issued a statement saying they believe individuals they refer to as radicals have infiltrated political parties and are preparing acts of violence in the capital. And so they suspended the campaign in Kinshasa. And this announcement was made just an hour ahead of the scheduled meeting for the opposition candidate Martin Fayulu. But thousands of supporters were already present at the location where the meeting was scheduled. Fayulu's team believed that this announcement was an attempt to stop him from campaigning earlier this week. And last week, he says that there had been other attempts to stop him from campaigning in other parts of the country. For example, one time his plane wasn't able to land. And so this latest development increases the level of tension in the country that is preparing to head to the vote on Sunday.
Well, these elections are historic. It could be the first peaceful transfer of power since the country gained independence from Belgium in 1960. But the challenges are enormous in a vast country of the size of Western Europe. In recent podcasts, we've brought you reports from our Africa correspondent Alistair Leithhead on his 6-week-long journey across the country. Now, in the final part of his series, he heads to the Far East, an area affected by decades of conflict and now by an outbreak of Ebola.
We're on board a large United Nations helicopter for a flight to Beni in North Kivu. The DRC's mission is the UN's biggest peacekeeping operation in the world and one of its most dangerous.
Arrived, get off the helicopter. Thanks, sir.
Afternoon. Everett Katz, I'm the head of office.
Nice to see you. How are you?
Likewise. We'll give you a short briefing. Please follow us.
Welcome to paradise.
Exactly, Beni Beach. What I should say is actually welcome to the perfect storm, because in the Beni field office area of responsibility, we had already all these security challenges, but meanwhile, we also have an Ebola outbreak since the 1st of August. We thought we had it under control last week, but it seems it's spreading out again.
Well, we're on a patrol with Malawian soldiers who are with the UN peacekeeping force here. We're in 3 armoured vehicles. It's a very dangerous area of Beni that we're in for 2 reasons. One, because there's Ebola in the area. Secondly, it's very dangerous. There's a group called the ADF. They've been around for about 20 years, but they're particularly active at the moment. And in the last few days, they've killed dozens of civilians. They're a real problem, and it's why the UN peacekeepers have come here to try and engage with the community, to show, look, we're here, we're present, we're trying to sort this out. The patrol stops at a small village. Some soldiers stand guard while others speak to the villagers. It's tense.
They are fearing for their security because any time the enemy can come and kill them. So
the UN is not popular here, as the attacks aren't being stopped.
They are wondering how can the enemy cross all of this bush and reach the town and start killing people just there at the town.
The local population around us.
The commander is getting nervous. He wants us to leave, as the militants may have infiltrated the village and be preparing to attack.
So it's dangerous to be here any longer?
Yes. Going beyond
there is a problem.
The UN has to show a tough stance, but protect its own soldiers. Funding's been reduced. The Brazilian force commander, Lieutenant General Elian Rodrigues Martinez Filho, says they're taking a new approach.
We have to understand that we have only 2 ways to really protect the civilian population here. To arrive in the village, in the area where the civilians are, before the armed groups, is one. And the second one is to go after the armed groups which are imposing threats to this civilian population.
But the government spokesman Lambert Mende Omalanga is very critical.
For 20 years, they are here, so-called to stabilize this country. How can you go to a country for 20 years to stabilize and you don't stabilize and you think that you have succeeded in doing something? So our story with the United Nations is not a success story.
Would you like them to leave?
We want them to leave in 2020.
I believe that UN is making the difference here because the state is not present in many areas of this country. So if we left the area, I believe the situation could worsen very quickly.
The situation in Beni is already worsening. The militant threat is strengthening, and with it the uncontrolled spread of Ebola as people flee the violence.
Alistair Leithhead reporting. Facebook is in hot water again over allegations that it's been sharing users' private information without their knowledge. An investigation by the New York Times says the social network shared access to personal data with other tech firms, including Amazon, Apple and Netflix. In some cases, the other companies have said they weren't even aware that they had special access. Our technology correspondent Rory Kethlen-Jones told me more.
The New York Times has got hold of a lot of documents which illustrate what Facebook was doing with what it calls partners. This is 150 companies that it was working together with, some of them tech firms, some of them online retailers and media organisations, including, ironically, the New York Times itself. Amongst the things they found was that Microsoft's Bing search engine was able to see the names of Facebook's users' friends without those friends' consent. Netflix, Spotify, the Royal Bank of Canada were able to read, write and delete users' private messages. The Russian search provider Yandex was allowed to index users' identities from public pages to improve its search results. Yahoo could see live feeds of friends' posts. All of these were companies that were kind of integrating Facebook services and needed a certain amount of access. But I think what is shocking to people is how much access they had.
And this is what Facebook is saying. They say they didn't agree to this, but they shouldn't have allowed it to happen. Is that enough of a defence?
Well, no. What Facebook is saying is that none of these partnerships or these features gave companies access to information without people's permission. I think what they're saying is that, well, for instance, if you tied your Spotify to your Facebook, there'd have been some box that you ticked kind of acknowledging what was happening. The sort of comeback on that is people tick boxes without really looking very closely. They slightly weaken this defence by, they say, yeah, everything was normal, everybody had permission, there's nothing to see here. And then they say, but most of these features have now gone, so we've moved on from that. And I think it illustrates the kind of continuing progress of this nightmare year for Facebook, whereby things that they thought were normal and they thought their users thought were normal, now people are being told about them, they don't think are normal at all, and they're very worried about. And I think the other problem is they're continually on the back foot. We had a very interesting tweet from a guy called Alex Stamos, who's just left Facebook as head of privacy. And he thinks there's a good defence, but he says their response has not been good. It just hasn't been clear. It's looked too confrontational.
It's trust, isn't it? That the public need to be able to trust Facebook again. What are they going to have to do to get that trust back?
I don't think it's going to be easy. I think it's going to be a long, tortuous process. And at every stage, they've been seen not to be transparent, and they have been on the back foot as these revelations have come, and they've appeared defensive. They need to somehow get out there with some big statement about what they're going to do with people's data and why they should be trusted.
That's our technology correspondent, Rory Kethlen-Jones. Now, regulators in South Africa have been accused of missing the joke after banning what was meant to have been a humorous advert for fried chicken. The commercial spoofed European colonialism, showing a young African armed with a spear discovering Europe. The regulator upheld a complaint that it mocked what had been a traumatic struggle. The fast food outlet Chicken Licken is appealing against the decision. Our correspondent in Johannesburg, Andrew Harding, examines the delicate balance between humour and offence in South Africa.
A long time ago...
The advert was supposed to be light-hearted,
A black South African set sail from home in 1650 and, reversing the true history of colonialism, lands in Holland a year later and names an entire continent.
You row.
The advert is in keeping with the local tradition here. Big companies using politics to sell everything from fried chicken to mobile phones.
Mr. President, truth or dare?
Corrupt elites are often ridiculed in the process.
Listen, I've got a Nando's delivery here for Mr. Gupta.
Colonel Gaddafi and Robert Mugabe, memorably pictured play fighting with water pistols.
Those were the days, my friend.
But South Africa's advertising regulator has ruled that ridiculing colonialism is a step too far, that the issue is still too traumatic. The company, Chicken Licken, insisted its advert was tongue-in-cheek. On social media, many black South Africans seem to agree. But caution is becoming more commonplace here, at a time when this country is re-evaluating its history, and some are not inclined to laugh about it.
Andrew Harding. Now, with Christmas just around the corner, millions around the world will be giving and receiving gifts in the coming days. So here's one of my colleagues who's got something for you.
Hello, it's Tim Harford here. I present the BBC World Service podcast, 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. And I'm very pleased to announce that there's a second season coming your way in 2019. Before that, though, would you like a present? Millions of people around the world are giving and receiving them at this time of year, and millions of children will also be getting gifts from a rotund, bearded man dressed in red and white who flies around the world on a sleigh pulled by reindeer. But who is Santa? Where does he come from? And crucially, what impact does he have on the modern economy? That's what I've been exploring for a special one-off episode. You can find it by searching for 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy wherever you found this podcast.
Now, until a few days ago, the United States had never sat around the same table with the Afghan Taliban. But now the two sides have completed 2 days of historic peace talks in the Middle East and are promising further talks soon. All this is raising hopes of a breakthrough which could bring to an end the long-running conflict in Afghanistan. But how likely is that, and what form might a deal take? Our South Asia editor Jill McGivering reports.
This was the latest of several meetings between the US Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad and the Taliban amid growing expectations. There was speculation that the Taliban might agree to a 6-month ceasefire, building on a short one earlier this year. The Taliban may be invited to join a new political process, taking part in an interim government. In return, the Taliban want prisoners released and a commitment to a US withdrawal. No sign of any of that being agreed yet, and the Taliban again refused to meet Afghan government delegates, which it views as illegitimate. But the fact there is dialogue is itself positive, and there's a sense too of the US trying to build wider support. After the talks, Mr. Khalilzad briefed Pakistan's army chief face-to-face, then flew on to Kabul to talk to leaders there. It's unclear if the Taliban really want to compromise. Some suggest they may be stringing Washington along, biding their time as they strengthen their position on the ground. They're taking part too in another regional peace process led by Russia. As the dialogue continues, so too does the violence, and Afghan civilians are paying the price. So far this year, more than 8,000 have been killed.
Jill McGivering. Now, in the earlier edition of this podcast, we brought you the news that the European Commission has begun making plans to avoid major disruption if Britain leaves the EU without a deal next March. The temporary measures are designed to ensure that life can go on as normally as possible, with legislation in key areas such as financial services, air transport and customs. But it's not just the authorities making plans. Our Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly has been to the French port of Calais. There he found everyone in the town assuming that the UK is going to crash out of the EU without a deal, and they're making their own arrangements accordingly. Here's his report.
Attention au départ.
It is numbingly cold at the Christmas fair in Calais, and the wind chill has driven all but the toughest tourists and townies away from the icy glitter of the neon-lit merry-go-round. It's pretty quiet. In Calais these days, where prosperity depends on proximity to England, it's always quiet.
Calais is dead.
Retired local wine merchant Luc Gilles is running a snack stall, mulling wine, and mulling the way in which Brexit is keeping away the Brits, who were already spooked by the weakness of sterling.
I stopped 4 months ago. It's finished. C'est fini.
Okay.
It's fini. I stop. I sell it. I stop because no more customers. 20 years ago, in my shop, I remember it's 80% British, 20% French. After that, it's 50-50. And the last time, it's 90% French and 10% British.
It is now only just over 14 weeks until the UK leaves the EU. And I know many
They are following Brexit in minute detail here, loving the theatrical knockabout in the House of Commons, but worrying where it's leading. Local MP Pierre-Henri Dumont, who's on the Brexit committee at the National Assembly in Paris, came back from meetings at Westminster convinced that the UK is going to crash out with no deal.
No one agreed on anything. You had no common views of your political leaders, on your political parties, on what Brexit should be. We, as your closest partners, we need to have clear answers to what's going on next. And we are 100 days away from the Brexit, and we don't have any clue yet on how we could deal with you in the next few months. It's really scary, actually.
At the port of Calais, they are planning new refrigerated sheds to inspect meat imports from the UK. Under the current single market rules, there are no checks. They're also preparing a new sea route to Dublin, so that trucks bound for Ireland will no longer head through England and Wales. The head of the port of Calais, Jean-Marc Puissesseau, says it looks like no deal to him too.
I think there will be no deal, because I am only looking at the situation. I can tell you, in France also we think there will be no deal. A lot of people think that. The wish of England is that there is, of course, a Brexit, but nothing should change. Many times I heard that, but many things will change. I think they should be very worried. I think they don't see the truth. I think they don't see the reality. I think they don't see the consequences.
There are white cliffs around Calais that precisely match the white cliffs of Dover, evidence that once it was geology which divided us. In the Channel ports, they're starting to worry that the looming political fissure might prove just as deep and just as permanent.
Kevin Connolly with that report. His lyrics are controversial, and now one of Tanzania's best-known hip-hop musicians has been banned from performing inside the country. Diamond Platnumz is quite a star, not only in Tanzania, but across Africa. Well, now the authorities say the lyrics of one of his songs is just too sexually explicit. Our Africa regional editor, Will Ross, told me more.
Well, there's a hip-hop scene in Tanzania known as Bongo Flava, and he's one of the people that really pioneered that type of music. And as you say, it's popular in East Africa, but he's also collaborated with quite a few musicians in the west of the continent, like in Nigeria, and that's really made him a star right across Africa. So he's big.
He has big, over 600,000 followers on Twitter. Is it just the one song, then, that is being objected to?
He's been in some trouble before over videos that have been seen to be too raunchy and things he's posted on social media. So this is the sort of latest trouble he's got into. The song in particular is called Mwanza, which is a city on the shores of Lake Victoria. And in the lyric, he kind of has a play on a word, and he says it in such a way that it suggests being sexually aroused. And he's kind of broken a word in two and left it hanging and then finished the word. So he's kind of teasing a bit there, and the authorities clamped down on it and said this song is not acceptable. And of course that led to a huge spike in the popularity of that song, so it did him some favours. But what then was the problem? He went on a radio show and he castigated the regulatory authorities, saying, how dare they ban this song. This is how I earn a living. How do they expect me to make money and musicians to survive? And that seems to have led to this ban on him performing, as you say, in Tanzania and outside the country.
And outside is interesting, isn't it? How on earth can they ban him from performing outside of the country?
Well, they can't really. I mean, he could jump on a plane, go and perform anywhere he wants in the world and get paid for it. But the problems he might have would be when he returns back to Tanzania, they could then, impose further penalties, perhaps increase the ban and cause him more problems. So he needs to try and build the bridge with this regulatory authority and allow himself to perform and earn money again.
That's our Africa regional editor, Will Ross. Finally, traditionally, American presidents tend to receive their fair share of honours, but this latest one may not appeal to Donald Trump. A newly discovered amphibian that buries its head in the sand has been named after him. Alice Porter explains why.
The Dimorphus Donald Trumpi was discovered in Panama. It's blind, looks like a worm, and primarily lives underground. It was christened by Aidan Bell, a British man who is co-founder of EnviroBuild, a company which produces eco-friendly building materials. He spent $25,000 at an auction for the privilege of naming the creature. Mr. Bell said he did it to raise awareness about climate change, accusing the president of burying his head in the sand over the issue.
We just feel that there's been a failure of leadership. There was a report by the UN IPCC, the Interplanetary Climate Change, that wasn't accepted because of the USA, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and Russia blocking it, and it wasn't getting any press. So we thought, ultimately it's clickbait, right? Let's not pretend it's anything more than it is, but it's very funny.
The amphibian is not the first beast to be named after Donald Trump. Last year, Neopalpa Donald Trumpi was discovered by biologist Vazrik Nazari in a collection of moths from the Museum of Entomology at the University of California. The scientist said the moth's unique bright blonde head colouring reminded him of the president. Barack Obama boasts the title of being the most commemorated of all US presidents, with 14 different species named after him, including a small coral fish from his native state of Hawaii, the Tosonoides obama. The fish has a small dot on the dorsal fin, which reminded researchers of Mr. Obama's presidential campaign logo. George W. Bush and his Vice President Dick Cheney have also been named after slime mold beetles. It's unlikely whether the naming of this latest amphibian will do anything to influence President Trump's views on climate change. His administration has pursued a pro-fossil fuels agenda, and he's cast doubt on whether humans are responsible for the Earth's rising temperatures. But for scientists around the world, perhaps the newly named Dimorphus Donald Trumpi will give them a little chuckle.
Alice Porter with that report. And that is all from us for now, but there will be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this edition or the topics covered in it, you can just send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Claire McDonnell, and until next time, goodbye.